Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video I'm going to tell you a few tips on how to counter every single killer in Dead by Daylight. For each killer I will provide a few attributes and also 5 tips on how to counter them. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to press the like button, and if you'd like to see more Dead by Daylight content, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It's free and it helps me a lot. Without further ado, let's jump straight into the video. The Trapper is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Disarm all traps that you see and do not vault windows unless you're sure that there are no traps on the other side. Tip number 2. You can use Dead Hard to walk over traps without triggering them. If someone is disarming a trap, you can walk over it as well. Tip number 3. Leave the loop when you see him placing a trap. Make sure that he is not faking it just to make you leave the loop and get a free hit. Tip number 4. When saving a teammate, be sure that there are no traps near the hook. Tip number 5. Avoid walking through tall grass as much as possible. The Wraith is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Pay attention to your surroundings. You may see his cloak shimmer when he is close to you. You may also hear him. Tip number 2. He can body block pallets and windows. Position yourself in a way that doesn't allow him to do so. Tip number 3. When he is cloaked, you can burn him using a flashlight, flashbang grenade, or firecrackers. Tip number 4. Use windows to avoid being hit when he gains movement speed after uncloaking. Tip number 5. He can do most actions while cloaked except grabbing and hitting. Use this to your advantage. The Hillbilly is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Use pallets and windows as much as possible to avoid being hit with a chainsaw. Tip number 2. If you are out in the open, you can use rocks and trees to avoid the chainsaw. Tip number 3. Forcing an M1 by vaulting pallets and windows is better than instantly getting down. Tip number 4. Make sharp turns around the corner when he is in his power. It will make it harder for him to follow you. Tip number 5. Get him to use his chainsaw as much as possible to get it overheated. When his chainsaw is overheated, he cannot use it. The Nurse is an average killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 3.85 meters per second. Tip number 1. The Nurse ignores all pallets and windows, so make sure that you don't use it too often. It is very hard to stun a Nurse using a pallet. Tip number 2. Break line of sight as much as possible and be unpredictable with your movement. Tip number 3. You can burn the Nurse when she is charging her blink, but it is very hard to pull off. Tip number 4. You can throw off most nurses by running at her while she is charging her blink. Tip number 5. Ideally, you will want to use Iron Will as it helps you lose her in a chase. The Shape is a tall killer that has a variable terror radius of 6, 16 or 32 meters and a variable movement speed of 4.2 or 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Look around you. This makes it impossible for him to catch you off guard. Tip number 2. Keep him as much as possible in Tier 1. This buys your team more time to do 1 to 2 gens. He is very slow in Tier 1. Tip number 3. Don't heal when he is in Tier 3. He can one-shot anyone, so it is useless to heal. Try to outrun the 60 seconds timer instead. Tip number 4. Break line of sight as much as possible. This denies him of precious stock. Tip number 5. Stay away from your teammates. This can give him a lot of stock. The Hag is an average killer that has a terror radius of 24 meters and a movement speed of 4.4 meters per second. Tip number 1. Pointing a flashlight at a trap disarms it. Tip number 2. Crouching prevents the trap from triggering. Tip number 3. When triggering a trap, your camera will face the phantasm. Make sure you react quickly. Tip number 4. Leave a loop when the Hag traps it. Be careful since she can fake placing down a trap. Tip number 5. If you know she is far away and busy, trigger as many traps as you can. The Doctor is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. You cannot be detected by the static blast while you are in the locker. Tip number 2. Be careful with your timing when dropping pallets and vaulting windows. He can use his shocks to prevent you from doing so. Tip number 3. When he is using his shock, he is slowed down, so you can keep looping the same medium-sized loop for a longer time before you have to drop the pallet. Tip number 4. Be careful when working on generators after being shocked, as the doctor is able to inflict random and reversed skill checks. Tip number 5. Stay as much as possible outside of Tier 3 madness. This tier makes it impossible to heal, mend, rescue, work on generators, and any other actions that are not related to chases. The Huntress is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 20 meters, a lullaby of 45 meters, and a movement speed of 4.4 meters per second. Tip number 1. Break line of sight as much as possible and be unpredictable with your movement. Tip number 2. Use tall loops and walls as much as possible. It makes it harder for her to hit you with hatchets. Tip number 3. Be careful when dropping pallets, as you may give her a free hatchet hit if you don't stun her. Tip number 4. Avoid being hit up in the open with hatchets, as she can always follow up with a basic attack and down you. Tip number 5. She may bait your wall and pallet drop, so be careful to fake it to avoid being hit with a hatchet. The Cannibal is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Use pallets and windows as much as possible to avoid being hit with a chainsaw. Tip number 2. If you are out in the open, you can use rocks and trees to avoid the chainsaw. Tip number 3. Forcing an M1 by vaulting pallets and windows is better than getting instantly down. Tip number 4. While he is using his chainsaw, you can enter the locker to prevent a hit, but you have to be very careful with timing. If you jump out too early, you will get hit, and if you jump out too late, he can grab you. Tip number 5. Avoid rescuing survivors from a face camping Bubba, even with BT. He can down both of you in 1 second. The Nightmare is an average killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters, a lullaby of 45 meters, and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. When he is teleporting, don't run away. Walk and hide somewhere close. If he commits, he will simply kick the gen and move away. Tip number 2. If you don't see any pulls for a while, be careful when dropping pallets. He may have one of the add-ons that switches pulls for fake pallets. Tip number 3. If he isn't around, run into his pulls. It will help you and your team later. Tip number 4. He is invisible when he is outside of a 24-meter range, and he appears and disappears intermittently between 16 and 24 meters of you, so look around a lot. Tip number 5. His terror radius changes to a lullaby and you become oblivious when you are asleep. So being aware of your surroundings is very important. You can wake up using alarm clocks. The Pig is an average killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Your first priority when you have an active trap on should be to remove the trap, especially on large maps. Tip number 2. If she places the second trap on you, go straight to the box that gave you the key the first time. The key is always in the same box. Tip number 3. Be careful when working on a gen, a box, and so on, as she may be crouching and ambushing you. Tip number 4. Use the long part of the pallet loop when she intends to ambush you. Tip number 5. When the exit gates are powered, all inactive traps placed on survivors are useless. The Clown is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Dropping pallets early is the best thing you can do against him. Tip number 2. Move to another loop after being hit. Tip number 3. Try to be unpredictable with your movement. He will have a harder time predicting your movement and knowing where to throw his bottles. Tip number 4. When he is restocking his bottles, make sure to move to another tile and make distance. Tip number 5. Take advantage of the yellow bottle as it gives you a movement speed boost. The Spirit is an average killer that has a terror radius of 24 meters and a movement speed of 4.4 meters per second. Tip number 1. Iron will negate her power. Tip number 2. She cannot see you while phasing, so it is a good idea to start walking on your scratch marks. Tip number 3. When she is phasing, you hear a distinct directional sound. Use it to position yourself. Tip number 4. Periodically, she phases passively. Don't let this fool you. She is still after you. Tip number 5. Avoid interactions, sounds, and walking in tall grass when you hear her phasing. The Legion is an average killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Spread out from other survivors. He benefits from slack survivors. Tip number 2. Avoid spending too much time healing. Tip number 3. Avoid dropping pallets when he is in frenzy. Tip number 4. Stunning him while he is in frenzy kicks him out of his power. Tip number 5. When in frenzy he cannot see scratch marks. Use this to bamboozle him. Dodging a hit while he is in frenzy also stops his power and puts it on cooldown. The Plague is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Avoid getting infected as much as possible. Tip number 2. Once infected, do not cleanse. This forces her to be an M1 killer. Being decent at looping is fine. Tip number 3. Stunning her while she has her black puke cancels her power. Tip number 4. Use tall walls and other line of sight blockers to dodge her vomit. Tip number 5. Avoid cooperating with healthy survivors when you are infected and vice versa. The Ghostface is an average killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Reveal him whenever you can. The easiest way to do so is by having him in the center of the screen and see at least half of his face. Tip number 2. Force an M1 to reset the stock meter. Tip number 3. Pay attention to your surroundings. You may hear his cloak when he is close to you. Tip number 4. If you keep him as much as possible from exposing you and you outrun the timer, he becomes an M1 killer. Tip number 5. If he is face camping, let him be unless you know for certain that it is impossible for him to expose you. The Demogorgon is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Use walls and pallets to dodge his shred attack. Tip number 2. Only destroy dangerous portals, not portals near an already repaired generator. If you leave safe portals, the Demogorgon will have less portals that he can use. Tip number 3. Make sharp turns around the corner when he is using his power. It will make it harder for him to hit you. Tip number 4. Break line of sight as much as possible and be unpredictable with your movement. Tip number 5. Be careful when performing any action near a portal, as Demogorgon is undetectable for a few seconds after exiting through a portal. The Oni is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Play really safe at the start in order to deny him from his power. Tip number 2. Split up from your teammates so it is harder for him to get his power and down multiple people in a single use of his power. Tip number 3. Make sharp turns around the corner when he is in his power. It will make it harder for him to follow you. Tip number 4. Heal up whenever possible to deny him as much blood as possible towards his power. Tip number 5. While he is in his power, trying to force an M1 is better than being downed. The DEATHSLINGER is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.4 meters per second. Tip number 1. Use line of sight blockers as much as possible to avoid being shot. Tip number 2. Vaulting and dropping a pallet early will make it harder for him to hit you with his power. Tip number 3. Use straight pallet loops in your advantage as he cannot down you through them if they are thick enough. Tip number 4. Struggle left and right to avoid being hit and to put environment objects between you and him. Tip number 5. Run to a different loop when he misses a shot. The Executioner is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. When dropping a pallet, move left or right immediately to avoid being hit by his power. Tip number 2. Break line of sight as much as possible and be unpredictable with your movement. Tip number 3. Try to avoid as much as possible being tormented, as it grants the Executioner the ability to place you in cages and Mora you when you are on the last hook. It saves him time which your team needs. You can crouch through trenches without being tormented. Tip number 4. While cages act as hooks mechanically, they do not trigger borrowed time, decisive strike, and any other perks that rely on hooks and unhooks. Tip number 5. Unless you are healthy and you have borrowed time, do not rescue a survivor near the killer, as either them or both of you can be downed in the process. The BLIGHT is an average killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. Break line of sight as much as possible and be unpredictable with your movement. Tip number 2. If you are out in the open, you can use rocks and trees to avoid being hit with his lethal rush. Tip number 3. Make sharp turns around the corner when he is in his power. It will make it harder for him to hit you when he is rushing. Tip number 4. If he is coming towards you from a distance, you can curve at the last second to avoid the hit. Tip number 5. Be careful when moving to another tile, as he can close the gap to you quickly. The Twins is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. To counter Victor, keep vaulting safe pallets and windows, as it can be really hard for him to pounce over and hit you. Also, be unpredictable with your movement when Victor is trying to pounce you. Tip number 2. If Charlotte is far away, you can jump in a locker. You should have enough time to open the door before Charlotte appears. Tip number 3. When Victor fails a pounce, go ahead and crush him. Victor can trigger Killer's Instinct when active, so make sure you go in and out quick and crush him whenever possible. Tip number 4. Remove Victor from your back before exiting through the gate. You can escape through the hatch with him attached down. Tip number 5. Split up from your teammates, especially when injured, so Twins cannot down all of you quickly. The Trickster is an average killer that has a terror radius of 24 meters, a lullaby of 40 meters, and a movement speed of 4.4 meters per second. Tip number 1. Use tall loops and walls as much as possible. It makes it harder for him to hit you with knives. Tip number 2. Be careful when dropping pallets. You may give him a few knife hits if you don't stun him. Tip number 3. When he is in main event, jump into a locker. Jump out the moment he enters fatigue. Tip number 4. Avoid staying out in the open or tight places. This makes it easy for him to hit you with knives. Tip number 5. Try to avoid being hit with knives for 10 seconds. This will make your laceration meter go down. The Nemesis is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. You can blind the zombies with flashlights. Tip number 2. If a zombie is coming towards you when repairing a gen, make sure that you place the generator on the opposite side of the zombie. Most of the time, this breaks the zombie's AI. Tip number 3. Avoid dropping pallets unless you know this will stun him. He may pull up his tentacle and get a free hit. Tip number 4. You can dodge his tentacle by moving left or right from where you are perpendicularly to the tentacle. Tip number 5. Use the speed boost from infection to move to a different tile and gain distance. The CENOBITE is a tall killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. When he is opening a portal, try hiding by a corner. It makes it harder for him to hit you with his chain power. Tip number 2. Ideally you want to do the configuration when he is carrying a survivor. This prevents him from teleporting to you. Tip number 3. You become oblivious when you are carrying the lament configuration, so being aware of your surroundings is very important. Tip number 4. The spawn location of the cube is rarely within 60 meters of you and almost exclusively further than 40 meters away from the CENOBITE. Tip number 5. Outside of a specific build with Hoarder and Franklin's demise, it is very hard for him to know where the cube is. Seasoned CENOBITE players will understand how the cube spawned and go straight to it, making it very hard for survivors to win. The Artist is an average killer that has a terror radius of 32 meters and a movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Tip number 1. You can burn her crows with a flashlight. Tip number 2. When she is placing down crows, move to a different tile and make distance. Tip number 3. It is always safer to enter a crow than being hit by one. Tip number 4. Be unpredictable with your movement and use line of sight blockers to prevent her from hitting you with crows. Tip number 5. If you time it correctly, you can avoid being hit by crows by moving left or right when she is launching them. That's it for today's video. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to press the like button. If you'd like to see more Dead by Daylight content, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It's free and it helps me a lot. See you next time!